Hello. Do you know your egoic self can be the single biggest enemy of your happiness? How, you might ask? Because the ego is responsible for the self inflicted suffering and delusions that arise from how we view ourselves. When you're immersed in self concern, it's easy to forget that there is any other way to be. So, if you want to find happiness, you need to transcend your ego to get to the bottom of what will really make you happy. We humans are unique in our ability to think consciously about ourselves. That's how we imagine, plan, or improve ourselves. A great asset. Yet, despite the obvious advantages of self reflection, the capacity for self thought comes at a high price as people's lives are adversely affected and their inner chatter interferes with their success, pollutes their relationships, and undermines their happiness. Why does that happen? That's because the ego blinds us to our shortcomings and promotes self-serving biases. So what's ego? You might want to understand. The ego is a self of our own creation, a made-up identity. It's the unnoticed mind that runs your life when you are not fully present in the moment. If we take all the beliefs of what we are, beliefs about our personality, talents, and abilities, we have the structure of our ego. It's the sense of I and we that fills our thoughts, every recollection, emotion, casual judgment, understanding. The content of the ego varies from one individual to another, but its structure remains the same. That is, the ego is an active, dynamic part of our personalities, playing an immense role in creating emotional drama in our lives. Just to give you an idea, whenever you feel superior or inferior to anyone, that's the ego in us. So deep down, all egos live on three things. Number one, identification. Number two, distinction. And number three, comparison. Now, before we get to our subject of managing ego, let's see what's the link between your ego and your happiness. It's simple. The ego thoughts the joy of being. Being must be felt, it can be thought, and thought is all the ego consists of. Whatever it craves or gets attached to is a surrogate for the being that it can feel. When the ego runs your life, you can never be happy except for brief interludes when you obtain what you want. But the ego's wants are never ending, believe me. In fact, wanting sustains the ego much more than having. It's fine to value and enjoy things, but when you get attached to them, the ego is behind it. Because you are attached to a thought that embodies I or mine, we or ours. The ego feels vulnerable and menaced and thus exists in a state of fear and want. It sees all things as either a threat or an object it can use for its own ends. The primary ego reflexes are designed to fight its own insecurity and inadequacy. It's constantly trying to protect and expand itself. So, to sum it up, let me tell you 7 ways in which the ego destroys your happiness. Number 1, it can give you an illusion of superiority or inferiority. Number 2, it brings you the need to dominate and control others. Number 3, it diminishes your ability to reason as it obstructs the reality of situations. Number 4, the ego pollutes your sense of self. It'll take every opportunity to attach itself to your desires and to your problems because it's always looking for something to append itself to in order to sustain and reinforce its deceptive sense of self. Now, this can lead to a great deal of ego investment in your unhappiness. For example, It's not only about achievements or successes or triumphs or possessions. For many people, their sense of self becomes identified with their suffering. Number 5, the ego makes you insecure. It may have the pretense of strength and confidence, but the ego is highly insecure, very vulnerable, and it sees itself as constantly under threat. It can't afford to be wrong. It strives for affirmation through possessions, fame, adulation, power, or victory. Number 6, the ego inhibits personal growth because learning requires humility and ego kills humility. And number 7, ego affects your health because it produces negative emotions like anger, greed, envy, jealousy, whatever. On the other hand, living without toxicity leads to good health. Now, coming to the topic of the day, how do we manage, control, or tame our ego? First thing we must understand is you are neither superior nor inferior to anyone. You are just you and nothing else. Self-esteem and humility both begin from that awareness. By the way, do you consider self-esteem and humility opposites? If you do, that's wrong. In a sense, they are the same, but that's for another day. For now, be yourself. People who don't attempt to appear to be more than they are, but are simply themselves, stand out as delightful, don't they? They perform their work without any self-seeking, heartily doing whatever the moment demands. Such people have a positive influence on others as they beget an alleviation of ego in everyone who comes into contact with them. Many people, however, are their own enemy. Their attention is always on themselves. Their ego demands personal recognition and squanders energy in bitterness when they don't get it. Whatever they do is no more than a means to that end. So the choice is yours, which of these two types you want to belong in. Second thing, it's okay to be wrong. The desire to be always right is ego. When you're more concerned with how the other person sees you than with the other person, then you are using others for egoic reflection. You are then trying to impress others through good looks, intelligence, possessions, or whatever. And naturally, then you are taking things personally. You wanting to appear important. No, stop. Privilege improving yourself over proving yourself. Third thing, never confuse having with being. The ego is always looking for something from other people or situations to use them to get what it wants. But the ego, its ingenious maneuvers never solve any of its problems because the ego itself is the problem. It tends to equate having with being and live through comparison. Most people let their ego run their life. Their entire self-image is invested in it. In effect, what they resist most is their own happiness. So remember, who you are and become is more important than what you have. Fourth, question your mind. American author Byron Katie says, an unquestioned mind is the world of suffering. Beautiful. You need to question your mind to understand how frequently your ego-based thinking ruins your relationships, makes you forego opportunities out of fear of failure, and hurts your health and happiness. Once you become aware of your self-defeating thoughts, it's easy to manage the ego, to control it. Fifth, strengthen self-control. The way to train the self to tame the ego is to enhance self-control and keep unwelcome instincts in check, not by using more willpower, because willpower is draining and doesn't work well in the long run, but by neutralizing what activates them. When we have trouble controlling temper or temptation, it's a state we create thinking about situation in particular way. So If you take preemptive steps to quiet or change your self-talk, reduce the demands of your ego, and interpret events in more benign ways, that would be a far more effective remedy than trying to contain reactions after you've already engaged. Sixth, live in the present. We have already covered living in the present moment in an earlier video. It's a powerful way to gain freedom from the ego through shifting your attention to the present moment. Remember, the ego in all of its manifestations can't survive without the dimension of time. When you remove time from its existence, the ego fades away. Final word, there is no right or wrong way to tame or control the ego. Discover what works for you, and when you learn what works, constancy is vital. All the best to you to wrest power from the ego and move toward greater intrinsic happiness. Let others learn from you. Please comment below how you manage your ego. Kindly subscribe to our channel and please don't forget to like the video if you found it useful. Take care and see you next time.